This is my mom's live-in handyman. My wife's son set it across the dinner table at Salt Lick Steakhouse on 17th Avenue in Calgary, loud enough for all 22 people in that private room to hear it clearly over the sound of wine glasses and polite conversation. I set down my fork. He was grinning. That particular grin I'd come to recognize over 4 years. Wide, easy, the grin of a man who believed every room was always laughing with him. My stepdad, he continued, gesturing toward me, retired at 61, living the dream. Honestly, some people just land on their feet. A few people laughed. Not everyone. Mia, his fiancée, looked at her plate. Her mother smiled the careful smile Canadians use when they're not sure what just happened, but want to appear gracious about it anyway. My wife, Barbara, laughed too. Just once. Brief. The laugh of someone who had heard a version of this joke before and had made her peace with it. That laugh is the thing I've replayed the most. Not because it was cruel. Barbara was never a cruel woman, but because it was comfortable. And somehow comfortable was the word that cut deepest. I picked my wine glass back up and took a slow drink and looked at nothing in particular. Across the table, Charles hadn't laughed. Charles was my former business partner. We'd spent 2 decades building infrastructure projects across Alberta together, taking a small regional firm and expanding it into one of the largest civil engineering outfits in Western Canada. He was 67 now, retired 2 years longer than me. He was the kind of man who smiled often and laughed carefully and never said anything he hadn't already considered. He wasn't smiling. He was watching my wife's son with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in 22 years. Something between calculation and recognition. Like he was assembling a picture he hadn't realized he'd been looking at. My wife's son kept going. He was in the rhythm of it now, working the table. Moved into the neighborhood, hung up his hard hat, and hasn't touched a project since. He raised his glass toward Mia's parents. Smart man. I said nothing. My jaw was tight. Outside along 17th Avenue, December in Calgary was doing what December always does, pressing down cold and clear, the Rockies sitting dark on the horizon. Charles folded his napkin, set it on the table, reached for the jacket hanging on the back of his chair. Mia's father looked over with a slight frown. Charles looked at me briefly, just long enough, and then looked at my wife's son with the expression of a man who has decided not to say the thing he is thinking, but has also decided it will be said eventually. Then he stood and walked out. The private room door closed behind him. 3 seconds of silence. Then conversation resumed the way it always does in this country. Politely, quietly, collectively deciding to let the difficult thing pass. I stayed at that table for another hour and a half. I watched my wife's son accept congratulations on the engagement. I watched him pour wine and tell stories. I watched Barbara refill my water glass without meeting my eyes. The drive home was quiet. The city was strung with Christmas lights that looked blurry through my windshield from the dry winter air. The truck's heater took the usual 8 minutes to kick in properly. I know because I've made that drive enough times to count. I didn't sleep. It wasn't what my wife's son had said. I'd heard variations of it before. Small comments, casual digs, the easy way he referred to my retirement as though I'd arranged it as a scheme rather than earned it across 4 decades in the field. I'd been filing those comments away the way you file away an irritating sound you tell yourself you'll deal with later. Eventually, they'd stacked up somewhere inside me without my permission. What kept me awake was Charles leaving. In 22 years, I had never seen Charles leave a room impulsively. Not during the winter that cost us the Fort McMurray contracts. Not during the audit that ran 3 months and nearly ended the partnership. He was not a man who made scenes, which meant that if he'd made one, even a quiet one, something had actually reached him. At 11:30, my phone rang. You awake? Charles. Yeah. A pause. There's a cafe in Inglewood, off 9th Avenue, the one with the bad coffee. I know it. 8 o'clock. He hung up without a goodbye. I lay in the dark until past 2, asking myself the same question over and over. What did Charles know that I didn't? The next morning was that particular kind of Calgary winter day that tricks you. Bright blue sky, sun low and sharp. Cold enough to hurt your lungs if you breathe too fast, but beautiful enough that you forget to care. I parked outside Crossroads Cafe at 5 to 8. Charles was already in the corner booth, black coffee, newspaper folded beside him, unread. Donna poured without asking. She'd been working that cafe long enough that she knew every regular by their drink. We sat in silence for a moment, steam off the cups, traffic building on 9th Avenue outside. Then Charles said, "I've been hearing things about you." I set my cup down. "For about the past year," he continued, "from different people, about your situation." He looked at me directly. "Ethan tells people you moved into Barbara's house after you retired. He talks about her supporting you. He frames it that way consistently." A pause. I thought it was family teasing at first. Then David, Mia's father, brought it up at the golf club in September. Asked me, very politely, whether you were doing all right. Whether Barbara was managing okay. Charles paused again. He believed it because he'd heard it repeatedly, and because Barbara had never contradicted it. That second sentence landed differently from the first. I drove home in silence afterward. Took the long way. Parked in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. In my office, I opened the filing cabinet and started a spreadsheet. The house was mine. I'd bought it in Altadore in 2011, 10 years before I met Barbara. 2 blocks from the Elbow River pathway, back when Southwest Calgary was still underpriced. Paid off by 2018. Worth close to $900,000 at last assessment. Barbara had moved in after we married. The deed had never changed. She knew this. My lawyer knew this. Our accountant knew this. Apparently, her son did not. But that wasn't the number I was looking for. I went through the folders methodically. His last 2 years at the University of Calgary. Tuition, books, the laptop I'd helped cover. The e-transfer records were still there. $41,200. Then the debt consolidation in 2021, when 3 max credit accounts caught up with him after an early real estate deal collapsed. I'd helped quietly, without making it a production. $26,500. Then the down payment assistance for his first condo, which we'd both pretended was a loan and had never discussed since. $55,000. Smaller amounts scattered through the years. A car repair in January, moving costs after a bad breakup. A weekend he'd put on Barbara's card that she'd shown me sheepishly later. I entered the last number. $168,400. I stared at it, not because it frightened me, because of what it represented. Not money, but moments, phone calls, crises, quiet gestures that I'd made without conditions, because that was what I understood family to mean. I sat back. Through the window, snow was settling on the cedar deck. A chickadee worked the fence. Then I called Judith, a woman in Barbara's circle. Neighborhood events, staff parties, someone who knew everyone without particularly meaning to. I'd found an email thread earlier while searching for old receipts. A forwarded message. A joke Barbara had apparently made at a gathering I hadn't attended. "You know Norman," she'd apparently said. "He has all the time in the world these days." Friendly, warm-toned, but the implication beneath it slid cold. Judith answered on the 3rd ring. We talked around the edges for a few minutes. Then I asked her directly whether Barbara had ever made comments, jokes, mostly, about my retirement. A pause. "She's very proud of you," Judith said carefully. "I know she is. That's not what I asked." A longer pause. "She jokes. Nothing mean. Just that you're home more now, that she keeps both of you occupied." Another pause. "I'm sure she doesn't mean anything by it, Norman." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The refrigerator hummed. Across the street, a neighbor was scraping ice off their windshield in the driveway. Ordinary Tuesday morning in December. Barbara hadn't set out to harm me. That much I was certain of. She wasn't a dishonest person by nature. But she had a particular habit, common in people who genuinely hate conflict, of allowing easier versions of the truth to circulate rather than correcting them. A harmless joke here, a gentle deflection there. Small choices that accumulate without anyone noticing. Until one day they've built a structure that has nothing to do with what actually happened. Her son had taken that structure and carried it further than she'd ever intended. And somewhere in the gap between what she'd meant and what he'd said, my actual life had quietly disappeared. That evening, I called Fraser, my lawyer, a thorough, unhurried man I'd trusted since 1998. I want to review my estate documents, I told him. What's mine outright? What's joint? What isn't? A brief silence. I've been waiting for this call, he said. 2 days later, before sunrise, I left a letter on the kitchen counter. 1 page, single space, no accusations, no elevated language. It stated clearly that I was no longer providing open-ended financial support without discussion, that any future assistance would be agreed upon directly, in advance, by both parties, that I expected honesty within the family I was part of. I drove to a diner on the north side and ate breakfast alone. By the time I finished my eggs, Barbara had called 5 times. The weeks that followed were not easy. My wife was distressed. Her son was furious. Barbara relayed this quietly one evening, trying to stay neutral, visibly struggling with it. He'd called it a betrayal, said I was pulling the rug, said that things had always been understood a certain way, and that I was unilaterally changing the terms. I asked Barbara what terms we had all understood. She didn't have a good answer. Then came the gathering. My wife's son organized it. He called it a family celebration for the upcoming wedding. He booked a private room at a hotel in the Beltline. I found out through Mia, who called me on a Tuesday, sounding careful and apologetic in equal measure. He just wants to talk things through, she said. I think he needs people around him when he does. I understood exactly what that meant. I wore my gray jacket and drove downtown anyway, because avoiding it wouldn't end anything, because I had nothing left to hide. The room was fuller than I'd expected. Extended family on both sides, Ethan's colleagues, Barbara's friends, Mia's relatives. He'd clearly wanted an audience. People make that choice when they're planning a performance and want witnesses to make backing down difficult. I found a seat near the back and settled in. For the first 40 minutes, things proceeded normally. Appetizers circulated. Someone near me discussed the Flames' struggling power play. Then Ethan tapped his glass and the room quieted. He spoke warmly at first. Gratitude, family, the upcoming wedding. Mia's hand on his arm. Then gradually, like a shift in weather you notice only after it's already changed, the tone moved. I think this gathering is also a time for honesty, he said. About what support looks like, and what it means when someone decides that support should be conditional. Murmurs of polite attention. He looked in my direction without quite meeting my eyes. Some people give generously while it suits them, and the moment it stops suiting them, they close the door. I folded my hands on the table, said nothing. Mia was looking at the tablecloth. Her father, David, was watching Ethan with an expression I recognized. The patient, precise expression of an accountant who has already done the arithmetic and is waiting for the appropriate moment. I'm not going to pretend that hasn't been painful, Ethan said. And then Charles stood up. He hadn't been on the guest list. I hadn't known he was coming. He was simply there near the side wall, in the same gray sport coat he wore to most formal occasions, holding a glass of sparkling water, waiting. The room turned. I apologize for interrupting, Charles said, in a tone that did not apologize at all. I'll be brief. He talked about the Lethbridge drainage project, what it had taken to deliver it on schedule through a procurement disaster that should have sunk us. He talked about Fort McMurray, the winter, when everything went wrong, and one person's decision to stay and rebuild it had saved 43 jobs. He talked about the Banff corridor infrastructure work, the hours, the winters, the personal cost of showing up for years in a field that didn't accommodate anything less than full commitment. He talked about what it meant to build something real and what the man who helped build it had actually done with his life before he retired. The room was very quiet. Then David stood. He was unhurried. He looked around the table the way men with nothing to prove tend to look around rooms. "I want to add something factual," he said simply. "The property in Altador. I looked into this myself after some conversations this autumn. It was purchased in 2011 and registered in Norman's name. Paid off in 2018. It was never Barbara's home that he moved into. She moved into his." He paused. "I thought people in this room should have that information." The room remained still. My wife's son's expression changed the way faces change when a version of reality you've been carrying collapses without warning. His entire argument had rested on an assumption, one he'd never verified, one he'd simply repeated until it felt like fact. And now it had been stated plainly, in front of everyone, by the man who was about to become his father-in-law. Later, a hotel event coordinator came to him quietly with a folder. I watched from across the room, watched the color leave his face. He'd booked the room expecting the situation to resolve itself, as it always had. Expecting that, by now, through the pressure of witnesses and the natural desire for peace, I'd have quietly agreed to cover it. He hadn't paid the balance. He didn't have the balance. He left the room not long after. Barbara didn't follow him. She crossed the room and stood beside me instead. We drove home without speaking. That night, she sat across the kitchen table. "I made it easier to let things be said than to correct them," she said. "I convinced myself they were just jokes, that you were strong enough that it didn't matter." She was quiet for a moment. That was cowardice. The kitchen was dim and warm. The window over the sink was fogged from the cold outside. "I failed you," she said. "I should have stopped it years ago." There was no performance in it. No elaborate apology constructed to sound like the right thing. Just a woman telling the truth to her husband at the kitchen table at night. Which is one of the harder things a person can do. "I know you did," I said. We talked for a long time that night. Not about money. Not about her son. About what a marriage actually requires. Presence, honesty, the ongoing daily choice to tell the true thing instead of the easy one. She had stopped making that choice incrementally, without meaning to, and she knew it now clearly enough to name it. Healing is not fast, not at our ages. You don't repair trust the way you replace a window. It takes months of small moments, none of them individually remarkable, all of them necessary. Ethan and I didn't speak for nearly a year. Mia reached out occasionally. Kind, careful, never pushing. The wedding was postponed. I heard through Barbara that her son was navigating some difficult months in his career. The Calgary real estate market had cooled significantly, and several deals he'd counted on had not come through. The world tends to teach what parents were unable to. One evening in late November, my phone rang with his name on the screen. I answered. He sounded different. Not smaller, just less certain than he'd always been. More deliberate with his words, the way people become after they've spent some time living inside the consequences of their choices. "I had the wrong understanding of who you were," he said finally. "For a long time. I don't know exactly where it started." A pause. "But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." It wasn't a long apology. It wasn't perfectly phrased. It was honest. And at 63, I've learned that honest and imperfect outweighs polished and hollow every time. "Thank you," I told him. We didn't become close overnight. That's not how these things work, and I wouldn't trust it if it happened that way. But things shifted slowly, in the careful way that trust rebuilds itself. Not through declarations, but through small, unremarkable moments that accumulate over time. What I understand now, looking back, is this. I confused keeping the peace with maintaining my own dignity, and they are not the same thing. Keeping the peace meant absorbing a cost that should have been distributed. The cost of correction, of honesty, of saying the simple true thing instead of the comfortable, false one. I absorbed it for years because I told myself, that's what patient people do. What reasonable people do. What people who don't want to cause trouble do. But patience only works when both sides are operating in good faith. And there was a version of events being told about my life, in rooms I wasn't in, by people who had no idea what I'd actually built or what it had cost me. I let that happen too long. Generosity cannot survive indefinitely without acknowledgement. Eventually, even the most willing giver reaches a limit, and the people who mistook generosity for entitlement will experience that limit as betrayal. They will be wrong. They will believe it completely. The mornings are quieter now. I sit on the back deck with my coffee when the weather allows, looking out toward the Elbow River pathway where the cottonwoods are bare in winter and green again by May. The city starts up around me. Ordinary sounds. Life continuing at its ordinary pace. If you've ever been the quiet one absorbing small cuts in silence, convincing yourself none of it amounts to anything, I want you to know that it does. And the moment you finally decide it's enough is not the moment you give up on your family. It's the moment you decide your family has to include you. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who actually see you for what you are.